Good day. The last couple of hours in the fighting in Ukraine have continued the pattern that we've seen over the hours which preceded them. Gradual assembling of forces by the Russians, missile strikes and artillery strikes by the Russians on Ukrainian military formations up and down the entire battlefront, and gradual positioning and gathering of forces by the Russians for a major strike to clear the remainder of Donbass. And we get some news that President Zelensky of Ukraine is once again making political decisions that are affecting the course of the fighting. Now, over the last week or so, much of the focus of the fighting in northern Donetsk is on the small town of Siversk. About a week ago, the Russians confirmed that they had actually reached Siversk and that fighting was ongoing in some of its suburbs. I mentioned the fact that this is a relatively small place, that it would be difficult to retain control over by Ukraine, and that one would assume that the Russians would capture it relatively quickly. And it seems that somebody in the Ukrainian High Command made that same decision, and there were reports over the next couple of hours that the Ukrainians had actually pulled their forces out of Siversk. Well, what we've now actually heard is that there are still some Ukrainian troops clinging on to parts of Siversk, and perhaps more importantly, that there's been a gathering of Ukrainian forces on the heights, the high ground west of Siversk, which has enabled the Ukrainians to maintain some degree of artillery shelling over Russian positions in the town. And that has deterred the Russians from a full occupation of the town itself. Now, I'm going to say straight away that once again, this looks to me like the repeat of the historic pattern that we have seen throughout this war of President Zelensky making decisions that ultimately reinforce failure, redeploying troops from central and western Ukraine to an untenable part of the Donbass battlefront, trying to cling on to territory that is almost certain to be lost eventually, and trapping Ukrainian men and material, troops and material, in positions where they are bound to be eventually encircled and destroyed. And that, it seems to me, is exactly what the latest information from Siversk is gradually pointing to. We learn of Russians sending in more drones to patrol Siversk, of intensifying Russian artillery strikes on these Ukrainian troops on the outskirts of Siversk, of these troops suffering ever heavier losses, but unable to retreat because their high command is giving them orders to stand and fight. And every so often we do actually get news of entire Ukrainian formations which have been so badly hit that they do in fact retreat, and of actions then being taken by the Ukrainian authorities to punish the soldiers or the officers who participated in these unplanned retreats. And the effect of trying to cling on to undefendable ground is that, of course, other ground which might logically be more defendable thereby gets weakened. Troops are pulled in from other places where they might be needed more or might do something more useful in order to hold on to a little piece of territory that in itself, in and of itself, may be less than fully important, but which anyway, and besides, cannot be defended very easily. I get the sense that the reason that President Zelensky is taking this step is because he's trying to draw a line in the sand. He's apparently, or rather his government is apparently on record as saying that Lysychansk would be the last city, Ukrainian city, to fall to the Russians, and that he's trying as hard as he can to cling on to the rest of Donbass. In my opinion, this is a completely hopeless undertaking. Sooner or later, the Russians are bound to break through, and eventually they will break through the Solidar, Siversk, Bakhmut line, which is already straining to be held, and that when they do break through, it will be easier for the Russians to move on to Slavyansk and Kramatorsk and to capture these places as well. But anyway, that is President Zelensky's philosophy. At the same time, we see Ukraine, or at least the Ukrainian military in southwest Ukraine, also trying to make more moves. There's been probing counterattacks, which have been thrown back apparently by Russian defenders with heavy losses. We see Ukrainian missile strikes close to that area of the dam across the Dnieper River that I talked about. Presumably these are with longer range HIMARS missiles, and I get the impression that either the Ukrainians are testing Russian air defenses in this area, or perhaps they're trying to soften up this territory in preparation for their much talked about offensive. Now, can I just say, the idea of destroying the dam has apparently been supplemented with an attempt to destroy a bridge, the Antonovsky Bridge in Kherson itself. And the rationale behind these attacks appears to be to try to cut Russian communications across the Dnieper, so that the Russian forces that are located west of the Dnieper become cut off from hopes of resupply. Well, in itself, I can see how that might make sense. But what I would say, the only thing I'm going to say about this, and remember again, I'm not an expert in this, is that from my own knowledge, trying to destroy bridges and dams, especially dams, is not as straightforward an undertaking as one might suppose. Bridges, and especially dams, are built with very high levels of redundancy for obvious reasons, and an odd missile hitting one of these things is not in and of itself likely to cause significant or irreparable damage. And I gather that this was the case, for example, with the missile strike on the Antonovsky Bridge. It did cause some damage, but it did not destroy the bridge. Now, that might be, and I stress might be because I don't really know enough about the system to be able to speak with confidence about this, but that might be a particular problem if you're using HIMARS rockets to attack these very, very big, heavy, well-built installations. Because from what I can see, HIMARS rockets are comparatively small. If you go onto the various websites, you don't get much information about the warhead that these systems carry, but the very fact, the size of the warhead, but the very fact that they have to be launched from the rocket tubes of a multiple rocket launch system suggests to me that they cannot be particularly big. And in fact, when I compared the HIMARS rockets, the ATACMS lot rockets, with those of, say, the Iskander system is significantly bigger and heavier. So I doubt that even a single strike by a Iskander system would be enough to destroy a dam. I suspect that it would take more than one. There's been many pictures of the Russians sending multiple cruise missiles to destroy one individual target. I think that you would need quite a lot of HIMARS missiles against either the bridge or especially the dam to do real damage, significant, irreparable damage against either. Now, I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm not saying Ukraine won't eventually get enough HIMARS systems to be able to do it, but it's perhaps not quite as straightforward as it seems. Now, whilst I'm on the subject of the HIMARS, the leader of the Donetsk People's Republic, a man called Duran, has now come out and said that he believes, and he's heard, that Ukraine has now indeed been supplied with the 300-kilometer ATACMS systems, missiles. Now, I'm assuming that he's getting this information from the Russian High Command, and I'm assuming that the Russian High Command is particularly well informed about what kind of weapon systems Ukraine has. And there's been all kinds of reports that the United States has given a green light to attacks on Crimea, which the Russians have made it very clear they would consider a red line, and that they would respond with devastating force, presumably against Ukrainian command centers, whatever that means. For the record, I suspect that means not so much the Ukrainian government as the various installations, the various bases of CIA officials, Pentagon officials that are probably scattered across Ukraine. And it's interesting that the US Embassy has issued an alert that says that all US citizens should leave Ukraine immediately. I wonder whether this is partly again because of concerns that there might be, or at least of plans perhaps, not so much concerns, of plans for some kind of Ukrainian attack on Crimea itself. And of course we've also heard information that Ukraine is now talking about destroying the entirety of Russia's Black Sea Fleet. A fact which, by the way, a claim that the Russians have responded by saying that it justifies the entire nature of the Russian operation in Ukraine, that the very fact that the Ukrainians are talking about attacking Crimea, that they're talking about attacking the Black Sea Fleet, all of this is a clear indication that as far as Russia is concerned, it was justified in launching its military operation against Ukraine in the first place. Well, we have, as I said, these rather sporadic and limited missile strikes. They're not on any very intense scale for the moment, that are taking place in various places in southwest Ukraine, in Kherson region, by the Ukrainians. They could be preparatory to some sort of offensive, but they're dwarfed by the Russian counter-strikes against Ukrainian installations in the area and against Ukrainian military formations in the area. These are on a very, very much bigger scale, and from what one can tell, they are inflicting heavy casualties. Now, of course, we can't be certain how accurate the numbers that the Russians give are for the amount of casualties they claim to be inflicting, but it does seem as if these are major attacks that are doing real damage, as opposed to the Ukrainian attacks, which up to now have done very limited damage. And one does wonder, truthfully, whether Ukraine will be able to gather together the forces it needs to launch this offensive in Kherson region effectively. And I'm going to make a speculation, I don't think it's much of a speculation actually, that Ukraine is being forced to take these steps to defend places like Siversk, which may be undefendable, and to at least consider or talk or assess plans for an offensive against Kherson region, not because the Ukrainian High Command thinks that these are good ideas. I suspect that they don't. It is because of the political pressure that is coming from the United States, from the administration. The administration, I suspect, is becoming increasingly concerned that support for the continued arming and financial aid given to Ukraine in the United States is waning. There's even now been a big headline in The Economist, the British magazine, which has pronounced neocon sympathies and which is extremely antagonistic to Russia, and which says that America is tiring of Ukraine. And I think this is causing some concern within the hardliners in the administration. And I think that they worry that if Ukraine visibly loses more ground in Donbass or fails to deliver some kind of successful counteroffensive in Kherson region, then support for the war in the United States will dwindle away to zero. So I suspect that this is now what is driving things, and that's why Zelensky himself has had to step in. He's had to give orders for this counteroffensive in Kherson region, and he's had to give orders for the troops in northern Donetsk to hold their ground, to accept all the punishment that they're suffering, because if more territory in Donbass is lost, and if no offensive in Kherson region happens, then Ukraine's backers in Washington will begin to become increasingly concerned about whether in fact they can hold the line for continued support for Ukraine in the United States. Now that, by the way, all reinforces my own general feeling that we are now very close to the moment of decision in this war in terms of the military aspect of the war. I said in previous videos that I get the sense that the Russians are gathering their forces in preparation for what they anticipate is going to be a knockout blow, specifically in Donbass and perhaps for all the territory west of the Dnieper River. And I suspect that the Ukrainians and their backers in Washington sense that they are in turn running out of time, that unless they can get some kind of breakthrough organized before the end of the summer, before the end of August, then things are going to look extremely grim for them and for Ukraine going forward. So the next couple of weeks are going to be extremely important in this war in Ukraine. If the Russians prevail, as I firmly expect, then I think that perhaps by mid-October, this is just a guess, and maybe completely wrong, we could probably see the Russians on the Dnieper River. And at that point, of course, the situation will look extremely grim for Ukraine, indeed existentially grim for Ukraine. Anyway, that's where we are on the military side. In the meantime, the two leaders in this conflict, President Zelensky and President Putin, have both been busy. Zelensky is continuing to carry through his purge of the Ukrainian intelligence and security staffs, and he's sacking people in many places. At least 28 officials have been sacked over the last couple of hours. Inevitably, the extent of these sackings is starting to trigger some worries, even in the West, that Zelensky's own position is perhaps less than fully secure. The fact that he is now talking about treason in every quarter rather points in that direction. But anyway, that is what Zelensky seems at the moment willing to do. Now, I've expressed my speculations about this, that it might be because of disappointment that the Kherson offensive hasn't happened yet, or might not happen at all, that it might be rage and a need to calm US concerns after the capture or sale of a complete intact HIMARS systems to the Russians, if that has actually happened. Or it may be indeed because Zelensky's own political position in Kiev is becoming less secure. By the way, several people have pointed out that the new head of the SBU, or I should say acting head of the SBU, is a known associate of the former president, Poroshenko, and that there's been some suggestions that this suggests that Zelensky's grip on Ukraine is starting to slip, and that this purge is in effect a kind of slow motion coup against him. Well, I've speculated enough on the causes of this coup, of this purge. I'm not going to indulge in more speculations about it. I'm afraid this is one of those cases where, again, we'll just have to see how events shape out and what eventually happens. But anyway, regardless of that, that's what President Zelensky seems to be up to. In the meantime, we get more indications that Ukraine is getting fewer weapons than it wants, and that the financial aid that Ukraine was looking for isn't coming through. There's been reports in Bloomberg that that the Commission, in particular the European Commission, is finding it difficult to justify to its auditors commitment of funding to Ukraine on the scale that has been promised and which Ukraine claims it needs. Anyway, we shall see. On the other side, President Putin has been extremely busy. Firstly, he held in Moscow another of his long series of meetings, the many meetings that he has, this time to discuss development of Russia's high technology sector. And he spoke about a reorganization within the government, appointment of a specific deputy prime minister to oversee development of this sector. He spoke about Russia developing the complete set of technologies that are needed, and a continuous cycle, a continuous production cycle in terms of high technology equipment, and that this is essential to guarantee the country's sovereignty and independence. Now, there's been a huge amount written about this, Russia running out of microchips and things of that kind. Little sign of that for the moment, by the way. As we've seen, Russian weapons continue to be churned out in enormous quantities. Russian missiles continue to rain on Ukraine with no sign of that slowing down. But anyway, there's been lots of speculation about Russia falling behind in the technological race. My overall impression of this meeting is that the Russians seem to think that whatever problems exist, and they're not oblivious to those problems, they can handle them. The one thing that perhaps is different is this belief that Russia should develop the entire production cycle in terms of high technology goods. And of course, China does this. I think it may by now be the only country in the world that does it fully. In other words, it produces every single component in some of its high technology equipment. I'm not saying that the Chinese don't import chips and things from places like Taiwan. They absolutely do. But overall, the Chinese high-tech sector has enormous resilience, precisely because the Chinese made sure that it does have that resilience. And it seems to me that the Russians are going to go down the same route. And I'm going to make a guess that in a few years' time, 1 to 5 years at most, we will no longer be talking about this topic. We will no longer be hearing about how Russia can't make 5G networks and all of these things by itself, because by that point it will visibly be doing it. People are repeatedly coming up with these stories about Russia. I've just been watching a very interesting YouTube video about how Soviet computers failed and things of that kind, and that there seems to be this inability to accept that whatever problems the Russians may have had in the past, which, by the way, in my opinion, are overstated, they can ultimately develop whatever technology they need. They have the engineering base, the the high technology base, the skills and the industrial base to do it. And they will do it. I think that there continues to be this lingering belief that Russia is this backward place dependent on Western technology. It can't drill its oil, it can't extract its gas, it can't build its ships, it can't set up its computer networks or IT networks unless the West helps it to do it. And I think that the sooner that illusion disappears, the better for everybody, by the way, for the West as well as for Russia it will be. And at that point, perhaps we will see the Western powers finally talking to the Russians in a somewhat different way than the one we've seen up to now. Anyway, that was one discussion that Putin had. It was an internal discussion, as I said, about the development of Russia's high-tech industries. But the other thing, and of course he's been on his way there, is he's now flying to Tehran, where he's going to meet the Iranian leadership and he's going to meet President Erdogan of Turkey. Now, there's been much discussion about what this is all about. There's talk in the West that he's going to talk grain with Erdogan and he's going to talk with Syria, with the Iranians, and to some extent with the Turks too. And I've no doubt at all that these are going to be important topics of discussion. After all, this is a meeting within the so-called Astana process. The Astana process is named after the capital of Kazakhstan, where at the end of 2016, the various top officials of Iran, Russia and Turkey came together and set up a group which was supposed to guide Syria towards peace. And there's no doubt at all that the Russians want to revive this group. But I think that there is a bigger story here, which is that, of course, the Russians are now very keen to develop their political and, of course, above all, their economic links with countries like Turkey and Iran. And Iran is now joining the BRICS group, of which, of course, Russia is a prominent and key member. And Turkey has shown interest in doing it. And I strongly suspect that this is going to be, deep down, the main topic of discussion, or at least the most important topic of discussion. Both Turkey and Iran are going to accept before very long the Russian Mir card. This is the Russian payment card in substitution for MasterCard and Visa, which the Russians have been have set up. And the Russians and the Iranians are known to be working on connecting their respective interbank messaging systems. And of course the Russians and the Iranians and the Russians and the Turks have also been working towards settlement in national currencies. Problematic, obviously, with Turkey, given the very high inflation rate there, but one can conceive of mechanisms which could be set up to get round that problem, whilst also easing whatever problems are created by the fact that these currencies are not fully convertible with each other. Anyway, regardless, that I think is what this is all about. I think this is more about maintaining the momentum of the process of integrating Iran and Turkey into the Eurasian institutions, the Eurasian Economic Union, the BRICS group, and of course the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And Iran, which is a non-aligned country, has of course a straight pathway towards doing that. With Turkey, it's more complicated because Turkey is of course a member of NATO, but and one which also has candidate status to join at some point the EU. By the way, it's had that for as long as I can remember. But anyway, the Turks do seem to be keen on integrating themselves to the extent that they can in these Eurasian institutions, and apparently they're already looking to make an application to join the BRICS. So that's, I suspect, what Putin is going to do. And I think Putin will also be talking to the Iranians and to the Turks about something else, which is about trying to find a route to improve Iran's relations with Saudi Arabia, which has also expressed interest in joining the BRICS group, and with which Russia has a very important relationship through the OPEC Plus arrangement, Saudi Arabia and Russia being two of the world's three biggest oil producers and exporters. The third, by the way, is the United States. So I think that the Russians will want to talk with the Iranians and with the Turks, who've each had at various times tricky relationships with the Saudis. The Iranians, of course, on a far worse scale than the Turks, but the Russians trying to find some means to diffuse these tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran, so as to draw Saudi Arabia into the BRICS system, as some Saudi officials, including apparently Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman himself, want to see happen. So a period of intense, concentrated diplomacy by Putin in Tehran. And here perhaps we see an interesting difference, because we see that Zelensky is busy carrying out purges in Ukraine. Biden has just come back from what I think is universally acknowledged to have been an unsuccessful trip to Saudi Arabia. He didn't get the Saudis to agree to increase oil supplies, which is the true reason why he went, despite whatever anyone may tell you. Whereas Putin, by contrast, is coming to these places, to Tehran, with, I think, a clear plan. And that plan, as I said, is to try to integrate Iran and Turkey in the Eurasian system, and at the same time to open a hand out, to reach out towards Saudi Arabia. Now, of course, saying that that's what Putin wants to do doesn't mean that it will happen. It's never easy to build long-term foreign policies in the Middle East. The Middle East is a volatile, unstable region. Governments change their positions very radically and very suddenly. And where you think you're making progress one day, you can find that everything has gone into complete reverse the next. So I'm not saying that this is necessarily what is going to happen, but I suspect that if there is any particular person who can make it work, who has the diplomatic skills and the knowledge of the respective players, and to a great extent the trust of the respective players to make it work, that person is Putin. And that's probably one reason why Putin is going. And I'm sure that he's making it, he's extremely careful at the present time to discuss all his steps in Tehran with the Chinese leadership, which of course also has a massive interest in the way this whole thing plays out. Now, I'm going to say something else about this trip by Putin to Tehran, because of course I discussed in a recent program how the situation between Iran and Israel is looking extremely grim, and we know all about the enormous sanctions that the United States has imposed upon Iran. And of course, the US sanctions on Iran have been fairly successful to a great extent because all the major economic blocs, all the major economic powers have up to now gone along with them, even if very grudgingly. But that calculus is now starting to change. Now, the Russians are showing growing interest in involving themselves in the Iranian economy. And there's also talk now about arms sales and deliveries. There's some talk again about the drones, the Iranian drones to Russia. But it's quite likely that there will be Russian supplies of weapons to Iran too. Now, the point is that once upon a time, when the Iran nuclear deal was in effect, and even before then, when the United Nations sanctions were in effect, and even when it was just US sanctions, the Russians were very cagey about getting too close to Iran because they didn't want to be hit by any secondary sanctions from the United States. Well, with all the sanctions that the United States has imposed on Russia, those inhibitions have now gone. The Russians no longer have to worry about having sanctions slapped on themselves, because those sanctions have already been slapped on them, not in connection with Iran, but in connection with Ukraine. And that, of course, gives the Russians much more freedom of action with respect to their relations with Iran. And I think that that means that with China showing an interest in investing in the Iranian economy, and with Russia perhaps prepared to play an important role as a middleman, we will start to see the effectiveness of US sanctions on Iran start to erode. There's another country where sanctions are starting to erode, and that's North Korea. North Korea has just recognized the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. And there's now talk that North Korean labor and technical people, the North Koreans are very good construction workers, reputedly, are going to be brought and will start working in the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, and perhaps in Kherson region and elsewhere. Now, consider that would once upon a time have provoked an American sanctions response. If the Russians had brought in North Korean workers, construction companies or businesses or whatever entity or agency North Korea has to carry out this sort of work, then of course the US would have imposed sanctions on Russia for doing it. What sanctions can the US now impose? It's very easy to see how this is going to act as an increasing economic lifeline, not just for Iran, but for North Korea too. The Russians could press on, sort it out with the Chinese, do all kinds of deals with North Korea from this moment onwards. And the leverage that the US once had over Russia to prevent the Russians from doing that has now in effect been thrown away. So don't know to what extent the Russians would be interested in getting too close to a country like North Korea, though they have always spoken respectfully about it, much more so than Western governments have done. It's not inconceivable that we could start to see the old economic connections that were built up between Russia and North Korea in the Soviet era starting to be revived. So one could see how the US sanctions war is now starting to enable the Russians, and behind the Russians, the Chinese, to press forward more vigorously with the whole process of Eurasian construction. In other words, integrating various countries, Iran, possibly Turkey, perhaps in a kind of a way North Korea too, into the web of Eurasian institutions, the BRICS, the Eurasian Economic Union, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, all of those, they gradually be brought in, more and more countries could be brought in, because the sanctions weapon has now lost its power. It's been used, and now the chamber is empty. Well, always when things are done in haste, they're not done well. I talked about this need by the United States as it senses, as the US government may sense that support for the war in Ukraine is starting to ebb in the United States. One can sense in the United States that there is growing unease about these Russian moves. And I can't help but feel that this is going to make the US even more determined to shape the outcome in Ukraine. And that no doubt explains the stand and fight orders given to Zelensky, which he's now passed on to his commanders in connection with northern Donbass, northern Donetsk, and perhaps this counteroffensive in Kherson region we've been hearing so much about. Time window is closing, as I've said many times, and with leverage over Russia having been lost, or to be more precise, thrown away, I suspect that people in Washington, as they begin to understand the implications and become increasingly alarmed, are going to want to step up the pressure. So more HIMARS deliveries, more long-range missile deliveries, more attempts to exert more economic pressure, more threats to countries like China and India, more attempts to achieve that objective of regime change in Moscow, which I suspect was always the true one. And the time window in which to do that is shrinking, and we could very well see all those attempts intensify over the next few weeks and months. Well, there we go. Thank you for joining me again for this program today. Remember, you can find us on our other platforms, Locals first and foremost, Rumble too, and Telegram, where our channel now is doing incredibly well. And I'm delighted to say that my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou is now back in harness. You can find him across all our platforms once more. In the meantime, remember, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, also by going to our shop, buying the great things that you will find there, our hats, our hoodies, our polo shirts, our magic mugs, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to press the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.